Man, you won't believe what went down on First Take yesterday morning. I'm getting ready for work, just trying to get my day started, and I've got ESPN on in the background like I always do while I'm making coffee and getting dressed. First Take comes on, and normally I might not pay super close attention depending on what they're talking about. But then I hear Molly Karam introduce a segment about the New York Giants and John Harbaugh, and I'm like, okay, let me actually tune into this, because the Giants have been making so many moves lately that it's hard to keep track of everything. So I stop what I'm doing and I sit down on the couch to watch, and there's Stephen A. Smith at the desk with Mad Dog Russo, and you can tell from the energy in the studio that they're about to get into something really interesting. Hey, what's up everyone? Before we dive into everything I have for you today, I need to share something real with you that would mean the absolute world to me. That subscribe button right there, hitting it right now, would bring me one step closer to my dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers. I know you're eager to get into all this content, but real quick, just smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. It's such a simple thing. It takes literally 1 second, but it's honestly the biggest way you can support this journey and help me reach that milestone. Trust me, every single subscription gets me closer to that goal. And honestly, it would mean everything to me. So, do me that quick favor right now and be part of this dream becoming reality. Stephen A. opens by talking about all the changes John Harbaugh has been making with the Giants organization since he took over as head coach. He's going on about how Harbaugh is essentially taking complete control of the entire football operation, how he's bringing in his own people to fill executive positions, and how general manager Joe Schoen is basically being pushed to the side. Stephen A. says there's reporting from Jordan Raanan and Bobby Skinner that the Giants are hiring some sort of executive vice president who will report directly to Harbaugh and not to Schoen, which is a huge deal because it shows who's really running the show now. Mad Dog is nodding along and he says, yeah, this is classic new head coach power play stuff. When you get a guy like Harbaugh who has the resume and the leverage, he's going to demand control. And the Giants clearly gave it to him. Then Stephen A. shifts gears and he starts talking about the Giants' quarterback situation. And this is where things got really interesting for me. He says the Giants have the #1 overall pick in the upcoming draft. Everyone expects them to take a quarterback. But Harbaugh has been doing a media tour lately, and he's been praising Jackson Dart like crazy, talking about how Dart was probably the #1 reason he chose the Giants' job, saying Dart is super talented and determined and a football junkie. Stephen A. says, but here's the thing. Dart is a rookie who just finished a season where the Giants went 3-14, and while he showed flashes, he's still very raw and inexperienced. Stephen A. says, if you're John Harbaugh and you're trying to win right away and establish a culture, do you really want to go into next season with just Jackson Dart as your starting quarterback? Mad Dog immediately jumps in and says, absolutely not. You need a veteran presence at that position, especially when you're a first-time head coach in a new organization trying to turn around a franchise that's been a disaster for over a decade. Mad Dog talks about how the Giants have been through so many quarterbacks over the years, how none of them have worked out, and how if Harbaugh is serious about competing in the NFC East against teams like Philadelphia and Washington, he needs someone at quarterback who can actually execute his system and not make rookie mistakes. Then Mad Dog says something that caught me completely off guard. He says, there's been some talk around the league that the Giants could potentially be interested in trading for Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins. When I hear this, I literally stop mid-sip of my coffee and I'm like, wait, what? Tua to the Giants? That seems completely random. But then Stephen A. starts explaining the logic behind it, and honestly, the more he talks, the more it starts to make a weird kind of sense. Stephen A. says, look, the Dolphins are in a really tough spot right now. Tua has had multiple concussions over the past few years. There are serious concerns about his long-term health, and Miami might be thinking it's time to move on and get whatever value they can for him while he still has some. Stephen A. says the Giants, on the other hand, need a veteran quarterback who can come in and be a bridge player while they develop Jackson Dart, and Tua fits that profile perfectly. Mad Dog is skeptical about this idea. He's like Stephen A., "Are you seriously suggesting the Giants should trade for a quarterback who's one hit away from potentially having to retire because of concussion issues?" Mad Dog says that's the definition of a high-risk move, and the Giants can't afford to gamble like that when they're trying to rebuild the entire organization. Stephen A. doesn't back down, though. He comes right back and says, "Mad Dog, every player in the NFL is one hit away from getting hurt. That's the nature of the sport. And yes, Tua has had concussion problem, but he's also a former Pro Bowl quarterback who, when healthy, has shown he can be really productive in the right system." Stephen A. says, if you can get Tua for a reasonable price, like maybe a third or fourth round pick, that's worth the risk because the upside of having a capable veteran quarterback far outweighs the downside of him potentially getting hurt again. Molly jumps in at this point and asks what Mike McDaniel and the Dolphins would be thinking in all of this. Stephen A. says the Dolphins are in a really difficult position because they've invested so much in Tua. They built their entire offense around his skill set, with all the speed and motion and quick passing. But the reality is, they can't keep putting him on the field and risking his health and potentially his life. Stephen A. says if the Dolphins can trade Tua to a team like the Giants and get some draft capital back, that allows them to move on to a new quarterback either through the draft or free agency and not feel like they're stuck in this terrible situation of having to decide between winning games and protecting their players' health. Mad Dog asks what the Giants would actually have to give up to get Tua, and Stephen A. says he thinks the price wouldn't be very high given all the concerns about his concussion history. He suggests maybe a fourth-round pick, or possibly a player swap involving someone like a backup offensive lineman or a young defensive back who hasn't worked out. Stephen A. says the Dolphins aren't going to get a king's ransom for Tua at this point. They'd probably just be happy to get something, rather than having him retire and getting nothing. Mad Dog says, okay, but even if the price is low, is Tua actually good enough to help the Giants win games? Or are you just trading for damaged goods and hoping it works out? Stephen A. gets pretty animated in his response to this. He says, Mad Dog, when Tua is healthy and playing well, he's a legitimate starting quarterback in this league. He talks about how Tua had that season a couple of years ago where he threw for over 40 touchdowns and was in the MVP conversation, how he's got accuracy and touch on his throws, and how he fits perfectly in Mike McDaniel's system. Stephen A. says the question is whether John Harbaugh can design an offense that maximizes Tua's strengths while also protecting him from taking big hits. And if he can do that, Tua could absolutely be productive for the Giants. The conversation shifts to talking about how this would affect Jackson Dart and his development. Mad Dog says, if you bring in Tua, aren't you basically telling Dart that you don't believe in him as your franchise quarterback? Stephen A. says, not necessarily. You're telling Dart that he needs to earn the starting job and that you're not just going to hand it to him because he was a high draft pick. Stephen A. talks about how the best thing for young quarterbacks is sometimes to sit and learn for a year rather than being thrown into the fire immediately, and having Tua as the starter while Dart watches and learns could actually be beneficial for his long-term development. Mad Dog brings up the salary cap implications of trading for Tua. He mentions that Tua is on a pretty expensive contract, and the Giants are already tight against the cap, so taking on his salary could limit what they're able to do in free agency. Stephen A. says, yeah, that's a valid concern, but the Giants could potentially negotiate with Miami to have the Dolphins eat some of Tua's salary as part of the trade, or they could restructure his contract to make it more manageable. He says, if you're John Harbaugh and you believe Tua can help you win games, you find a way to make the money work. They spend some time discussing what Tua's arrival would mean for the Giants' offensive system. Stephen A. talks about how Tua thrives in a quick passing offense with lots of pre-snap motion and misdirection. And he says the Giants have some weapons that could work well in that kind of system. He mentions Malik Neighbors, who's an incredibly talented young receiver. He talks about Wan'Dale Robinson, who's a gadget player who can line up all over the formation. And he says, with the right play calling, Tua could actually have success in New York. Mad Dog says yeah, but Tua also needs an elite offensive line to protect him given his injury history. And the Giants' offensive line has been mediocre at best for years. Stephen A. acknowledges this is a concern, but he says that's why you invest in the offensive line through the draft and free agency. He says the Giants have high draft picks, and they have cap space if they use it wisely. So there's no reason they can't build a competent offensive line over the next year or two. Stephen A. says you can't let one weakness prevent you from addressing other needs. You have to attack everything at once and trust that your coaching staff can develop players and put them in positions to succeed. Molly asks them to address the elephant in the room, which is Tua's health, and whether it's even ethical to keep letting him play football given how many concussions he's had. Stephen A. gets really serious for a moment and says that's a great question, and it's something that goes beyond just football strategy. He says Tua is a grown man who can make his own decisions about his career and his health, but the teams and the league also have a responsibility to protect players from themselves sometimes. Stephen A. says if the Giants were to trade for Tua, they would need to have very frank conversations with him and his doctors about what the risks are and what precautions can be taken, and they'd need to be prepared for the possibility that his career could end at any moment. Mad Dog says that's exactly why he thinks this trade doesn't make sense, because you're investing resources in a player who might not even be able to finish the season. He says the Giants would be better off just rolling with Jackson Dart and seeing what they have in him, or maybe signing a lower-risk veteran like a Jacoby Brissett or someone similar who can be a bridge quarterback without all the health concern. Stephen A. says, but those guys aren't as talented as Tua, and if you're trying to win games in the NFC East, you need the best possible quarterback you can get. The conversation continues, and they start talking about John Harbaugh's overall vision for the Giants and how a move like this would fit into it. Stephen A. mentions all the quotes Harbaugh has given recently about how he's building this team to beat the Philadelphia Eagles, how he won't tolerate lack of effort, how he's already working on salary cap planning and free agency. Stephen A. says Harbaugh is clearly a coach who wants to win right away and not go through a long rebuild, and if that's the case, then bringing in a veteran quarterback like Tua makes more sense than just hoping Jackson Dart develops quickly enough to compete in year one. Mad Dog says he understands that Harbaugh wants to win, but he's worried the Giants are going to make the same mistake they've made over and over again, which is trying to find shortcuts instead of building a foundation the right way. He talks about how the Giants have cycled through so many quarterbacks and coaches and general managers over the past decade, and none of it has worked because they've never committed to a real plan. Mad Dog says if they trade for Tua and it doesn't work out, they're right back where they started, except they've wasted another year and given up draft picks in the process. Stephen A. fires back pretty passionately. He says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, and the Giants have been doing the same thing for years, which is drafting quarterbacks and hoping they develop. Stephen A. says maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to bring in a veteran who's actually played in meaningful games and knows what it takes to win, and then let your young quarterback learn from him. He says that's what successful franchises do. They don't just throw rookies to the wolves and hope for the best. They also discuss what the Dolphins' perspective would be on all of this. Mad Dog mentions that Miami has built their entire offense around Tua and Mike McDaniel's system. So if they move on from Tua, they're basically starting from scratch offensively. Stephen A. says, yeah, but the Dolphins might not have a choice. They can't keep rolling Tua out there and risking catastrophic injury. And at some point, they have to make the difficult decision to move on for his own good and for the good of the franchise. He says trading Tua to the Giants would at least give Miami something back and allow them to start fresh with a new quarterback. Molly tries to get them to make predictions about whether this trade is actually going to happen. Stephen A. says he thinks there's maybe a 30% chance it happens. It's definitely being discussed, but there are a lot of obstacles to overcome, including Tua's health, the salary cap issues, and whether the Giants are actually willing to give up on Jackson Dart as their immediate starter. Mad Dog says he thinks it's even less likely, maybe 15%, because he just doesn't see the logic in trading for a quarterback with so many red flags when you have other options available. The segment starts winding down and they both kind of summarize their position. Stephen A. says the Giants need to be aggressive and creative if they want to turn this franchise around, and trading for Tua Tagovailoa could be exactly the kind of bold move that signals they're serious about competing. Mad Dog says he thinks it's too risky, and the Giants would be better off sticking with their current plan of developing Jackson Dart and building through the draft. Molly thanks them both, and the show goes to commercial. I'm sitting there on my couch, finishing my coffee, just trying to process what I just heard. Tua Tagovailoa to the New York Giants is absolutely not something I saw coming, and it seems like such a risky move given all his concussion issues. But after hearing Stephen A. explain the logic, I can kind of see how it might make sense from a football perspective if you ignore the health concern. The Giants need veteran quarterback help. Tua, when healthy, is actually pretty good. And if the price is low enough, maybe it's worth taking the chance. Whether it actually happens or not is anyone's guess, but it's definitely one of the more interesting trade scenarios I've heard discussed lately, and I'm curious to see if there's any actual smoke to this fire or if it's just speculation.